The snow had buried the road so completely that I could no longer tell where the highway ended and the frozen wilderness began. My car had stopped moving 20 minutes earlier, the engine refusing to turn over, while the temperature outside kept dropping. Then I saw a familiar figure through the white storm, an older woman stumbling toward me, desperately trying to keep her balance. When she finally reached my car and I opened the door, my heart nearly stopped. It was my ex-girlfriend's mother. The woman who had once welcomed me into her home like a son was now standing in front of me, freezing, frightened, and completely alone. She climbed into the passenger seat, closed the door with trembling hands, looked at me with tears in her eyes, and whispered something I never expected to hear: "Please, don't tell her about tonight." If you enjoy emotional stories about second chances, unexpected kindness, and the people who change our lives when we least expect it, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves heartfelt stories, and subscribe to Ripple of Kindness for more stories about second chances. 3 years earlier, I had believed I would marry her daughter. Her name was Emily, and for almost 4 years she had been the center of my world. Her mother, Margaret, had never treated me like a temporary boyfriend. She remembered my birthday, packed food for me when I worked late, and always told me that no matter what happened between Emily and me, I would always have a place at her table. But life has a cruel way of changing things. Emily and I slowly became strangers while still living inside the same relationship. Arguments replaced laughter. Silence replaced plans. Eventually, she ended things, saying she needed a different life and a different kind of man. I tried to accept it, even though every part of me felt broken. The hardest part was losing Margaret too. After the breakup, I never called her. I thought it would be disrespectful. I assumed she would choose her daughter, and perhaps she had. So I disappeared from their lives completely. I changed my number, moved to another part of the city, and buried myself in work. I convinced myself I was healing, even though some nights I still remembered Margaret's kitchen, her warm smile, and the way she used to say that good people should never be ashamed of loving deeply. Now, 3 years later, I was driving home after visiting a client when the snowstorm arrived without warning. The weather forecast had predicted light snow, but within an hour the sky had become a violent wall of white. Cars were disappearing from the road. Drivers were abandoning their vehicles. My GPS stopped working, and when my engine finally died, I realized how dangerous my situation had become. That was when Margaret appeared. She was wearing a thin winter coat, completely covered in snow. Her car had apparently slid into a ditch several hundred meters away. She had tried to walk toward a roadside emergency station but became disoriented in the storm. I pulled her into my car immediately, wrapped my spare blanket around her shoulders, and turned on the emergency heater. She kept staring at me as if she couldn't believe who had found her. I asked whether Emily knew she was out driving in the storm. Margaret looked away. Then came those words. "Don't tell her about tonight." I thought she meant Emily would worry about her, but something in Margaret's expression told me there was more to it. We waited inside the car for nearly an hour, hoping the storm would weaken. It didn't. The wind shook the vehicle so violently that snow began piling against the windows. Margaret's hands were still cold, so I gave her my gloves and told her to keep them. She smiled sadly and said I hadn't changed. I laughed quietly and told her that everything had changed. She looked at me for a long moment before saying that she had been afraid I would hate her. I couldn't understand why. Then she finally told me the truth. After Emily and I broke up, Margaret had discovered that her daughter had been seeing someone else before our relationship ended. She had known that Emily had emotionally moved on months earlier, but she had never told me because Emily begged her not to. Margaret had spent years carrying the guilt of watching me believe that I simply hadn't been good enough. I felt the air leave my lungs. Suddenly, memories I had spent years trying to forget began making sense. Emily's constant distance. Her sudden late nights. The coldness that appeared without explanation. The way she had blamed everything on my failures. I asked Margaret why she was telling me now. Her eyes filled with tears. Because she had been diagnosed with a serious heart condition, she said, and she had recently learned that she might not have as much time as she thought. She wasn't afraid of dying as much as she was afraid of leaving certain things unsaid. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was an old photograph of Emily and me. On the back, Margaret had written a sentence in her handwriting: "Some people leave your life, but that doesn't mean their love was meaningless." She told me she had kept the photograph because she remembered how happy we had once been. She also admitted something else. She had never wanted Emily to know that she had contacted me several times after the breakup, only to delete every message because she didn't want to interfere. I looked at the woman sitting beside me and realized something painful. While I had spent 3 years believing that I had been forgotten, someone had quietly remembered me all along. The storm continued through the night. Eventually, the rescue team located us. They helped us reach a small roadside shelter where a few stranded travelers were already gathered. Margaret was exhausted, so I stayed beside her until morning. I made her tea, found a warm blanket, and called the hospital to make sure someone knew where she was. Before sunrise, she took my hand. She told me that she had one final request. She didn't want Emily to know that she had revealed the truth about the past. She didn't want her daughter to feel betrayed by her mother during what could be the hardest period of her life. I told Margaret that I wouldn't tell Emily. But I also told her that she didn't need to protect everyone anymore. For the first time that night, she cried. Not the quiet tears she had been hiding, but the kind that come when someone has carried too much for too long. A week later, Margaret called me. She had been admitted to the hospital for treatment. I visited her, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw Emily. She froze when she saw me standing beside her mother's bed. There was anger in her eyes at first, followed by confusion and then something I hadn't seen in years: regret. Margaret looked between us and smiled. She didn't reveal what had happened during the snowstorm. Neither did I. Instead, she simply told Emily that sometimes life gives people a second chance to say the things they were too proud, too frightened, or too hurt to say before. Emily sat beside her mother and began crying. I quietly stepped outside. For years, I had thought closure meant receiving an apology. That morning, I finally understood that closure could also mean letting go of the need for one. Margaret survived her treatment. Her recovery was slow, but she became stronger. Emily and I never returned to the relationship we once had. Some doors are better left closed. But we eventually forgave each other, not because the past had suddenly become acceptable, but because carrying anger was no longer worth the wait. Months later, Margaret invited me to dinner. She placed my old photograph on the table and smiled. She said the snowstorm had stranded 3 people that night: her, me, and the past we had both been running from. And perhaps that was why the storm had come. Not to destroy us, but to stop us long enough to finally understand each other. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who may need to hear a story about forgiveness, and subscribe to Ripple of Kindness. Sometimes one small act of kindness can become the beginning of an entirely new chapter. And before you leave, comment "second chance" if you believe that some people enter our lives not to stay forever, but to teach us something we were meant to carry for the rest of our journey. Because sometimes the people we think we've lost forever are the very people who help us find ourselves again.